All right, welcome everyone. Happy Friday. Welcome to another episode of PT on Ice Daily Show. Hope everyone had a wonderful 4th of July holiday and have a great weekend ahead. My name is Jason Lunden. I am the lead for the Endurance Athlete Division. So teach Rehabilitation Injured Runner live and online, as well as a professional bike fitting course. And what I'm going to cover today is what vertical adds to the equation. So talking about uphill and downhill running, both hills and in the mountains, and what the differences are compared to level running, why that matters, and then how to safely progress um, that training for yourselves and your patients. So uphill and so adding vertical to one's training obviously means adding some uphill and downhill running, and those are obviously different than running on level ground. So uphill running is characterized by a lot more mechanical work, meaning there's a huge increase in the load on the muscles, as well as changing the biomechanics of running so that one is landing in more of a flex position at the hip and the knee, as well as more dorsiflexion at the ankle. And that uh, the amount of hip flexion, knee flexion, and ankle dorsiflexion is much higher in uphill running than level running and or certainly downhill running as well. Stance times are longer. Uh, the amount of time in flight is lessened, and impacts are overall less. As far as contrasting that with downhill running is characterized by landing with a lot uh, more the knee and a lot more extension, a lot less hip flexion, and then depending on the experience of the runner for running downhill. If it's more of a novice runner, they're going to be characterized by striking with a rear foot strike pattern or heel strike pattern. And if it's more experienced downhill runner or trail runner, it's going to be characterized by more of a midfoot strike pattern. Here, there is downhill running is basically characterized by negative work, so it's all eccentric work. So a lot of more impact to the runner, and a lot less load specifically on the muscles, just more of an eccentric load. And so why does this matter? So thinking about your patients that you might be working with, if you have someone with a high hamstring tendinopathy, that's likely going to be loaded a lot more and potentially irritated more with uphill running, right? Because that hip is going to be in more flexion. There's going to be more muscle work, particularly on the posterior chain with that uphill running, and that repeated high hip flexion angle is going to also cause some compression at that hamstring insertion. Whereas if someone is dealing with patellofemoral pain or maybe medial tibial stress syndrome, downhill running is going to really increase the stress on those areas with that increased impact and eccentric load, and uh, definitely irritate those symptoms. And so you want to be thoughtful when prescribing or getting those runners back into uh, dealing with a vertical, that if it's a high hamstring tendinopathy, you may want that runner to be hiking the uphills and then running the downhills. And then conversely, if it's someone with patellofemoral pain, you'll want them to be running the uphills and hiking or walking the downhills. Um, and in addition, if someone is running, whether it be on the road or on the trail, and they have a race that has, a vertical profile with some elevation gain and loss, you definitely want them to be implementing hill workouts or running in uh, varied terrain early on in their training so that they have the time to adapt to those new loads on the muscles and on the joints, as well as adapt their running mechanics appropriately too. So typically, if it's someone who's new to trail running and they're going to be running their first trail race and there's 5,000 vertical elevation gain and loss, they're going to be wanting to implement that training far out in their training, so months ahead of time. Again, because of the differences in the mechanics and the loads on the muscles with uphill and downhill running. As far as ways to implement this safely, there really isn't any scientific evidence on this. It's mainly anecdotal. A lot of kind of looking at a lot of advice that coaches will give is really based on the 10% rule or the literature that we have on progressing training volume in running. So no more than 10% increase in vertical per week, or certainly no more than 15% over the course of 2 weeks is a common piece of advice that you'll hear. So what does that look like? If someone is running 10,000 or sorry, 1,000 vertical in the first week, you wouldn't want to increase by more than another 100 the following week if you're doing that 10% rule. And that's going to be really more for your novice runners. And generally for your novice trail runners or novice runners that are or novice runners running hills, it's going to be looking like probably being able to add 1,000 feet of vertical in their first week, and then progressing from there with that 10% per week, or no more than 15% for 2 weeks. If it's a more experienced trail runner that you're working with, who has had a lot of experience of doing a lot of vertical, they could probably safely uh, start at approximately 50% of what their vertical was prior to dealing with their injury. Uh, and then kind of last thing to consider is, okay, so we're talking about vertical, but how are we progressing that in the space of also progressing just running volume as well as intensity? And so a good rule of thumb here is to not, ideally the safest way is to not progress all three of those elements in the same week, but realistically that's probably going to have to happen. And so the best place to start out is not increasing all of them combined by more than 15% per week. So what that would look like is, I am running, um, 50 miles a week. I'm doing 1,000 foot of vertical a week. And then also uh, within that week, probably, adding in a speed workout as well. And so for the next week, I would want to not increase my weekly volume by more than 10%. So we keep that at 10%, and then not increasing the combined vertical and amount of intensity work by more than 5%. So that would get us our 15% total there. So again, just to recap, adding vertical or dealing with vertical with endurance athletes is going to be very common, especially for those of you living in more mountainous regions, where trail racing is king. But even for your road racers too, if they're going to be running a race with a vertical profile, so not Chicago Marathon, but maybe Boston Marathon, where there are some hills, you really need to be thoughtful of how to, one, implement that training, as well as how to progress that training, and how running uphill is going to stress their body differently, how it's going to change their mechanics. So again, uphill running is going to be a lot more load concentric on the muscles, especially on the Achilles, the glute, the hamstrings, and it's going to be characterized by a lot more, a much deeper angle of flexion at the hip, knee, and ankle, whereas downhill running is going to be characterized by a much larger eccentric load, with potentially being at a rear foot strike versus a midfoot strike, and adding a lot of impact. To progress that, we want to kind of draw on the information and experience we have from both coaching and the literature, which is going to be drawing on just level running, so not increasing vertical by more than 10% per week, or not increasing vertical volume and intensity for a sum of more than 15% per week. And wanting to implement this early on in their training so they have time to adapt to the stresses of training. I'll leave you with just one really cool article that came out more recently, which was looking at downhill running and adaptation to that. And really as little as one bout of 30 minutes of downhill running on a 20% grade results in what they call the bout effect, or it's really a protective effect on eccentric muscle damage and delayed onset muscle soreness. So after that one bout, the next time the runner runs downhill, they're going to have less eccentric muscle damage and therefore less delayed onset muscle soreness. So that's pretty cool. So definitely wanting to implement that downhill running as soon as you can into their training so they start getting those adaptive effects. All right, well, thank you everyone for listening. We do have some endurance athlete courses coming up. Coming up right around the corner on July 8th is when our next cohort of Rehabilitation Injured Runner Online starts. So that is the last one for the summer. So we'd love to see you online for that. Our next professional bike fitting course is going to be in Denver at the end of July. And then our next Rehabilitation Injured Runner Live is going to be in Sparks Glen Cove, Maryland in September. So we'd love to see you at those courses. Reach out if you have any questions. Have a great weekend. Get outside, do something fun. See y'all.